Title: The HOA War, a homeowner's battle for justice. Ethan Carter stood in his backyard, breathing in the crisp suburban air, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. After years of saving, working late hours, and skipping vacations, he finally owned a home. His home. It was a modest yet charming two-story house with a spacious backyard, perfect for the garden and patio he'd always envisioned. The neighborhood seemed peaceful, lined with well-manicured lawns and uniform houses. The only thing that stood out was a sense of eerie perfection. Every home seemed almost identical, as if governed by some unspoken rule. Ethan didn't have to wonder for long. A sharp knock on his front door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, a woman in her late 50s stood there, arms crossed, clipboard in hand. Her short blonde bob framed a face that exuded authority and an unwavering sense of control. "You must be Mr. Carter," she said, her voice clipped and precise. "I'm Margaret Thornton, the president of the HOA. Welcome to Oak Ridge Estates." Ethan nodded. "Thank you. It's nice to meet you." Margaret's lips curved into a tight smile, but something was unsettling about it. "I wanted to discuss something regarding your property. I assume you've reviewed the community guidelines." Ethan frowned. "I skimmed through them. Is there a problem?" Margaret flipped through her clipboard and pulled out a highlighted map. She tapped a section with her pen. "This portion here, about 10 feet of your backyard, is actually part of the HOA's communal space. The previous owner incorrectly included it in the sale. We're reclaiming it." Ethan's eyebrows shot up. "That's impossible. My deed shows this land belongs to me." Margaret's smile didn't falter. "HOA policies supersede private ownership. You'll need to comply. Failure to do so could result in penalties." Ethan's grip tightened on the doorframe. "I bought this property fair and square. You can't just take my land." Margaret waved a dismissive hand. "Mr. Carter, I've been running this HOA for over a decade. Trust me, fighting us never ends well." Ethan felt a prickle of unease. He had a feeling this was just the beginning. At first, Ethan thought Margaret was bluffing. There was no way she could legally seize part of his property. Then came the letter. An official document from the HOA demanded he relinquish 10 feet of his backyard for community use. The letter warned of fines and legal action should he fail to comply. Ethan wasn't the type to back down. He took the letter straight to the city records office and requested a copy of his property lines. As he suspected, the land was rightfully his. With documents in hand, he attended the next HOA meeting, determined to set the record straight. When he walked in, Margaret was already seated at the head of the table, surrounded by other board members. Their faces were unreadable, but Ethan sensed unease among them. He placed the deed on the table. "This proves the land is mine. You have no legal grounds to take it." Margaret barely glanced at it before shaking her head. "HOA policies override property deeds." Ethan stared in disbelief. "That's not how the law works." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Mr. Carter, I run this neighborhood. Everyone here follows my rules. If you fight me, you will lose." Ethan scanned the room. Some homeowners exchanged sympathetic glances, but no one spoke up. That's when he realized Margaret had done this before. Ethan began speaking to his neighbors, one by one. The stories he uncovered were worse than he imagined. One family had been forced to tear down a custom-built shed because Margaret claimed it violated aesthetic standards. Another homeowner was fined thousands for a fence that had existed before they moved in. An elderly couple had been threatened with legal action for growing tomatoes in their front yard. "She makes up rules as she goes," an elderly neighbor whispered. "You either follow them or she finds a way to make your life miserable." Ethan soon learned this firsthand. Within a week, he received his first violation notice: improper lawn maintenance. His yard was pristine. Then came another, citing unauthorized backyard furniture. He only had a simple patio set. It didn't stop there. His mailbox was flooded with passive-aggressive letters. The HOA newsletter publicly shamed him as uncooperative. His water and electricity were mysteriously shut off one night. A billing error, they claimed. Then, one morning, he stepped outside and saw the ultimate insult. His property markers had been removed. In their place stood a new HOA sign declaring his backyard future community walkway. Margaret was waiting for him, arms crossed. "Looks like it's official now." Ethan clenched his fists. If Margaret wanted a war, she was about to get one. Ethan wasted no time. He contacted a lawyer specializing in property disputes. After reviewing the case, the lawyer smirked. "You've got yourself a classic HOA tyrant." "So what do we do?" Ethan asked. "Legally, she doesn't have a case. We'll send a cease and desist letter." Within 48 hours, the letter was delivered to Margaret's doorstep. Ethan made sure to hand it to her personally. She barely glanced at it before scoffing. "Legal threats? Cute. You really don't understand how this works, do you?" Ethan's jaw clenched. "I understand that you're trying to steal from me." Margaret laughed. "The HOA has dealt with men like you before. Just wait. You'll crack eventually." Ethan smirked. "We'll see." The next morning, 2 fresh violation notices were taped to his door: excessive lawn height and unauthorized decorations. Ethan sighed. So that's how she wanted to play it? Fine. He was done playing defense. It was time to go on the offensive. Ethan decided it was time to fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone Margaret had bullied. He started collecting evidence, talking to neighbors, recording complaints, and compiling stories of her overreach. Word spread fast. Homeowners who had once been too afraid to speak up now shared their own horror stories. A family had been fined thousands over a garden gnome. Another was forced to repaint their house 3 times because Margaret deemed the shade off-putting. With each testimony, Ethan built his case. He wasn't just fighting for his backyard anymore. He was fighting to take Margaret down. With enough evidence in hand, Ethan knew it was time for action. He printed flyers exposing Margaret's reign of terror and distributed them throughout the neighborhood. He created a private online forum where homeowners could share their stories and organize resistance. Then, he called for a special HOA meeting. When the day arrived, the room was packed. For the first time, Margaret's confident smirk faltered as she realized the tides had shifted. Ethan stepped forward. "Margaret, your time ruling this neighborhood unchecked is over." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. It was time to bring her down. Ethan stood before the packed HOA meeting hall, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. Homeowners, many of whom had suffered under Margaret's tyrannical rule, sat in tense anticipation. Margaret sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, her expression dark with barely contained fury. Ethan took a deep breath. Margaret Thornton has abused her power for years, enforcing made-up rules, issuing unfair fines, and bullying homeowners into submission. But it stops today. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. He pulled out a thick folder and began laying out documents on the table for all to see. Here are records of fraudulent violations issued under her authority. Here are testimonies from homeowners she's harassed. And here, he flipped to the final page, is proof that HOA funds have been used for personal expenses. This is financial misconduct. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Margaret shot up from her chair. "This is ridiculous. These are baseless accusations." Ethan remained calm. "They aren't baseless if they're backed by facts." A man near the back stood up. "Margaret, I was forced to repaint my house 3 times because of your preferences. The HOA paid for a consultation, but I later found out that money went to your friend's company." Another woman rose. "My mailbox was out of compliance, so you had it removed. I had to buy a new one from a vendor you personally approved." More and more residents started standing, adding to the accusations. The crowd was no longer just murmuring, it was angry. For the first time, Margaret looked shaken. She gritted her teeth. "You people have no idea how hard it is to maintain order. Without my leadership, this neighborhood would fall apart." Ethan stepped closer. "Or maybe, without you, it will finally be free." The HOA board members, who had been silent throughout the meeting, exchanged nervous glances. It was clear that even they could no longer ignore the uproar. One of them, an older man named Robert, cleared his throat. "Given the overwhelming complaints, I motion for an immediate vote of no confidence in Margaret Thornton as HOA president." Margaret's eyes widened. "You can't do this. I am the HOA." Another board member, a younger woman who had seemed hesitant before, spoke up. "We can actually. And it's time." Ballots were distributed. Margaret sat stiffly, her face red with anger as homeowners cast their votes. It was clear to everyone how the vote would go. When the results were tallied, Robert stood. By a landslide majority, Margaret Thornton is officially removed as HOA president. Effective immediately. The room erupted in applause and cheers. Some people hugged, and others clapped Ethan on the back in gratitude. The weight of Margaret's rule had finally lifted. Margaret, pale and shaking, rose slowly from her seat. She glared at Ethan. "You think this is over? You have no idea who you're messing with." Ethan met her gaze, unfazed. "I think you're done here, Margaret. It's over." With nothing left to say, Margaret stormed out of the hall, slamming the door behind her. The days following Margaret's removal were transformative. The HOA board, now under new leadership, held emergency meetings to repeal many of Margaret's arbitrary rules. Homeowners who had been fined unfairly were refunded, and unnecessary restrictions were lifted. Ethan watched as the neighborhood changed before his eyes. People began to make small renovations they had long been denied. Children played freely in yards that had once been under constant scrutiny. A collective sigh of relief seemed to settle over Oak Ridge Estates. One afternoon, as Ethan watered his lawn, a familiar figure approached, Robert, the new HOA president. "Ethan, the board and I wanted to personally thank you. You did what we were too afraid to do." Ethan nodded. "I just wanted to make sure no one else had to deal with what I went through." Robert chuckled. "Well, thanks to you, we've officially dissolved the HOA's ability to enforce arbitrary fines. We're keeping basic community maintenance, but nothing like what Margaret pulled." Ethan smiled. "Good. That's how it should be." Robert hesitated before handing him an envelope. "One more thing. We collected donations from grateful homeowners as a thank you. We know you spent a lot fighting this." Ethan opened it, and his eyes widened at the amount. He shook his head, grinning. "You didn't have to do this. We wanted to. You earned it." As Robert walked away, Ethan looked around at his home, his backyard, still fully intact, his land rightfully his. He had won. And he had done it not just for himself, but for everyone. For the first time since moving in, he felt at peace. Just as Ethan thought life would return to normal, a letter arrived in the mail. The return address made his stomach drop. It was from Margaret's lawyer. Ethan tore it open and scanned the contents. Margaret was suing him for defamation, claiming that his actions had caused emotional distress and reputational harm. The letter threatened a lawsuit demanding damages over $250,000. Ethan exhaled sharply. Unbelievable. He immediately called his lawyer, James Thornton, who laughed as he read the letter. "This is a desperate move. She has no case. But we'll take it seriously." Margaret's lawsuit forced Ethan back into battle mode. He gathered evidence of everything. Emails, recorded meetings, and public records proving that Margaret had been the one abusing power. His lawyer filed a countersuit, not just for defamation, but for damages caused by Margaret's previous misconduct. The legal battle that followed was tense. Margaret played the victim, painting Ethan as a vindictive troublemaker. But with every piece of evidence that came to light, the court saw the truth. In the end, the judge dismissed Margaret's case entirely and ruled in Ethan's favor. Margaret was ordered to pay for all legal fees, effectively bankrupting her. Her last attempt at revenge had failed. As Ethan left the courthouse, he spotted Margaret sitting on a bench, staring into the distance, defeated. He walked past her without a word. The war was finally over. With the lawsuit finally behind him, Ethan felt a strange sense of calm. The war was over, and he had come out victorious. Margaret had been defeated, the HOA was restructured, and Oak Ridge Estates was finally a peaceful neighborhood. But something still lingered in the back of his mind. One afternoon, Ethan sat on his back patio, watching the sun set over his yard, the same yard he had nearly lost. He had spent months fighting for his home, but now that it was truly his, he wondered, what was next? His phone buzzed. It was a call from a local journalist. "Ethan, your story has gained quite a bit of traction. We'd love to do a feature on you, maybe even talk about homeowner rights and HOA abuses." Ethan hesitated. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight, but if sharing his experience could help others, maybe it was worth considering. "I'll think about it," he said. Days later, Ethan received another unexpected message, this time from a legal advocacy group that fought against abusive HOAs nationwide. "Mr. Carter, we've been following your case. What you did was remarkable. Would you consider speaking at one of our events? There are thousands of homeowners facing similar issues, and your story could inspire them." Ethan chuckled. "I'm not exactly a public speaker." "You don't have to be. Just tell your story." After some thought, Ethan agreed. He had spent so much time defending his home, it only made sense to help others do the same. A few weeks later, he found himself standing in front of a packed auditorium. As he told his story, he could see the recognition in people's eyes. They had all faced their own versions of Margaret. Some had lost, some were still fighting, and some, thanks to him, now dared to push back. For the first time, Ethan realized his battle had never been just about a backyard. It was about standing up to corruption, about not letting someone take what was rightfully his. And that was something worth fighting for. Months passed, and Ethan's life gradually returned to normal. His house, his yard, and his neighborhood were no longer under constant scrutiny. People stopped whispering in fear, and the community felt like a true home. Then, one evening, as he was locking up for the night, he noticed someone standing at the edge of his property. Margaret. She looked different, tired, her once perfect posture slumped. Gone was the iron-fisted dictator who had ruled over Oak Ridge Estates. Now, she was just a woman who had lost everything. Ethan sighed and walked up to her. "What are you doing here?" She let out a bitter laugh. "Just wanted to see it one last time before I leave." "Leave?" "I sold my house. Couldn't afford to stay, not after everything." She shook her head. "I spent 10 years running this place, and now I have nothing to show for it." Ethan crossed his arms. "You did this to yourself. You tried to take what wasn't yours." She exhaled sharply. "I thought I was doing the right thing. Keeping order, making sure everything was perfect. But I guess I took it too far." Ethan studied her for a moment. "You didn't just take it too far. You hurt people. You bullied them because you liked the power." Margaret didn't argue. She just stared at the neighborhood she once controlled. "Well, it's not my problem anymore." She turned to leave but then paused. "I suppose you'll be happy to see me gone." Ethan shrugged. "Honestly, I just hope you learned something from all of this." Margaret scoffed, but there was no venom in her voice. She gave him one last glance before walking away, disappearing into the night. Ethan never saw Margaret again, but her departure marked the true end of the battle. Months later, he walked through the neighborhood and saw families enjoying their homes without fear of ridiculous fines or sudden rule changes. People were planting flowers in their front yards, painting their homes however they pleased, and simply living their lives without the oppressive cloud of the old HOA. Robert, the new HOA president, approached him with a grin. "You know, Ethan, we've been thinking about renaming the park after you." Ethan laughed. "I think I've had enough attention for a lifetime." "Well, you changed things here. That matters." Ethan nodded. He had never set out to be a hero. He had just wanted to keep his home. But in doing so, he had helped everyone in Oak Ridge Estates reclaim their freedom. And that was something worth remembering. Years later, Ethan stood in his backyard, watching his kids play on the grass he had fought so hard to protect. Life had moved on, but every now and then, he would look around and remember everything it took to get here. He had stood up against corruption. He had refused to be bullied. And in the end, he had won. As the sun set over Oak Ridge Estates, Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the peace that had once seemed impossible. The war was over, and home had never felt sweeter.